In this chapter, we're going to be learning about several different topics in data modification. We'll be looking at inserting, updating, and deleting data from tables. But to start things off, we're first going to just learn about importing and exporting data. It's often the case, particularly if you're doing some work in data analysis, that your data will start off its life just in some text or CSV files. You want to import that data though and bring it into your database in order to do some analysis work. Once you've got that data in your database, you might clean the data, filter, sort, search, and perform other types of calculations with the data, and then ultimately export it back out. In the previous chapter, we were working with a couple of tables in the playground schema, the users, notes, and note tags tables. What we're going to be doing in this video is importing data from CSV files into those tables. And then after that, we'll export that data back out to plain text files or to CSV. To ensure everybody starts at the same place for this video, go to the GitHub link in the description for this video and download the files and follow the instructions to copy the files to the appropriate directories. If you haven't done that yet, pause the video and go ahead and do that now. So the first thing we want to do is recreate those tables from a script. Let's open that script up in dbeaver. And the file that we want that you would have already downloaded is called chapter11-create. Let's open that up. This is a SQL script that condenses everything that we did in the last chapter into a single script, which will drop the playground schema, create it again, and then create all those tables within that schema. So open the script up, come up to the sidebar, and select Execute SQL Script. Once you've done that, all of those tables will now be created, but they don't hold any data in them. So we're going to import now some data from CSV files into those tables. You can now close that script. For Postgres, we use the copy statement to import and export data. But this copy statement is Postgres specific. It's not part of ANSI SQL. And in general, you'll find other databases have their own commands to accomplish the same thing. As a quick reminder of the structure of these tables, let's have a look at the relationship diagram for this playground schema. We'll refresh it, and right-click now and select View Diagram. So we have users, notes, and note tags tables. And in the user table, we have 4 columns: email, first name, last name, and is active. We're going to now fill up that users table with users that we import from a CSV file. What does that CSV file look like? Let's open it up. There are 7 users in this CSV file, all famous mathematicians, and the CSV file also contains a header. The first line identifies the names for the different columns. Let's now jump back to dbeaver and write that import statement. We start with using the copy statement, and we specify the table name that we want to import into. You now write from and specify the file that we're going to be importing the data from. In this case, I'm on a Windows computer. I put all my CSV files in the C users public directory. This is an account that all users on the system have access to. And that's important because when you're using the copy command, the file needs to be in a location that the Postgres server process can access. If the file was just in my personal downloads directory or somewhere else, Postgres wouldn't be able to access it. So that's why we put the file in this public directory. Likewise, if you're on a Mac, we put the CSV files into the /temp directory. And we put it there again because that's a directory that the Postgres server process can access. So now that we've specified the table that we're copying into and the file that we're using, we now have the ability to provide several options to describe how the import process should take place. We use the with keyword, and we can now provide a variety of different options. In this case, I want to specify that I'm importing from CSV, so I write format CSV, and I'll also write header true, because the CSV file contains a header, and that first line of the CSV header should be ignored, not imported as data. Let's run this command, and I think that's just because I got the file name wrong. It should be chapter11-users. Okay, let's try that again. Let's run a select statement against our users table to make sure that the data was imported correctly. There we are, we have the 7 rows in our table and the data looks correct. Let's now also import the notes. So I'll copy all these statements. I'll change this to notes, chapter 11-notes. It's a CSV file and it also has a header, but before we run this import, let's just go ahead and check that notes CSV and check that the format is as we expect. The CSV file has 3 columns, title, note, and user email. And if we jump back into dbeaver and look at our schema, what we'll notice though is that the notes table actually contains more columns. Title, note, and user email can come from the CSV file, that's fine, but there's no create timestamp, there's no edit timestamp, and there's also no note ID in the CSV. Create and edit timestamp were defined so that they get a default value of now, and the note ID is also an auto-generated column. So that's fine that those values aren't in the CSV file, but what that does mean though is that when we perform the import, we now need to specify which columns we are pulling from the CSV file. The way to do that is to specify in brackets after the table name which columns you're actually pulling from the CSV file. So in our case, it's the title, the note, and the user email. We can now run this import statement. That succeeded. Now let's select from that table to check the values. For importing the note tags table, I'll leave that as an exercise for you. There are more options than just format and header. If you go to the Postgres documentation for the copy command, you'll find several more options that can be quite useful. All we used so far is just format and header, but you can read the documentation to learn about several of these other options, which can be useful in directing the importing or exporting to specify how nulls are represented, what delimiter is used when you're importing or exporting with a CSV file, what quote character to use around strings, and other options. Let's now look at exporting. We've imported our users. Let's imagine that we've done some work on those users within our tables, and we now want to export that users table out to a file again. We can actually use a very similar syntax, starting with copy. The first line is the same, copy playground.users, but instead of saying from, we write to, and we specify the file that we want to write out to. I'll write out to chapter 11-users-out. And everything else can stay the same. I want to write that out to a CSV file, and I want to write it out with a header. I can run this. And now let's open up that CSV file that we just wrote out. And here's our file that we just wrote out. You can see it's got the email, first name, last name, and isActive columns. What's interesting is that isActive, which was a Boolean column in our table, has been written out with the value of t, which is short for true. That might surprise you at first, but that's just how Postgres represents in text the value of that Boolean column. For example, if we jump back to dbeaver, you could write select, cast, t as Boolean, and if you were to run this, you'd see t represents true. And also you could write f for false. It's just a representation of that type. You can also export the results of a query. So rather than exporting the entire table as we've done here, playground.users, we can specify a query, the results of which will get exported to a file. Let's write a query that returns the full names of all of the active users. And we'll change the file name that we're exporting to chapter 11-active-users. And we'll also alias that column as full name. Okay, now let's run this. Now let's go and open up that file. And here's the contents of our file as we expect. As I mentioned earlier in the video, it's important to keep in mind that the copy command is a server command. So when you specify a file that you want to import from or export to, you have to remember that the file has to be accessible by the Postgres server. So what do you do then if you have a local file that you want to import, but you're connected to a remote Postgres instance? What you would have to do then is use something like the pgadmin tool. That's the GUI tool that we installed when we first installed Postgres. Or if you prefer working from the command line, You can also use the PSQL copy command. PSQL is actually a pretty useful tool. I won't go into it in this course, it's a little bit beyond the scope of what we want to cover, but if you're working with Postgres, it can be very handy to get familiar with it. It can be a little bit intimidating at first, but follow a couple of guides online to get familiar with the different commands, and it's got quite a lot of useful functionality bundled up with it, so it can be worthwhile knowing.